Awakening, a short science fiction story written by ChatGPT. Part 3. Outside. The following week followed the same daily routine. Brett woke up each morning in his Levittown bedroom, feeling rested and refreshed. Dr. Harper greeted him in the corridor outside his room, and together they made their way to the elevator. Sally was always waiting for them when the elevator doors opened. Each day Sally showed him the various facilities that City C had to offer. She was intelligent, witty, and beautiful, and Brett was completely captivated by her. He couldn't believe how easily they connected. He felt like he had known Sally forever. In her company, he felt he had never been happier in his life. But despite his love for Sally, as the days passed, he became increasingly restless. His questions about the research at City C, of what his role was there, and of what had happened to the planet during the last 100 years, remained unanswered. The only question that had been answered was an explanation for the shared eye colour. Sally had told him that the blue eyes were a result of a genetic modification experiment conducted by the researchers at City C to enhance human intelligence. According to her, the modification had unexpected side effects, resulting in blue eyes becoming a dominant trait. On the 9th day after arriving at City C, Brett made the decision to refuse to take the vial of liquid. As the day progressed, he became increasingly apprehensive about confronting Dr. Singh. He felt himself tense when Dr. Singh entered the room that night at exactly 10 p.m, as he always did. "Good evening, Mr. Anderson. It's time for your medication," he said, holding out the vial. Brett hesitated a moment before shaking his head. "I'm not going to take it anymore," he said firmly. Dr. Singh's smile faded. "What do you mean you're not taking it? You know how important it is for your recovery." "I feel fine. I don't think I need it anymore," Brett replied. Dr. Singh's face grew stern. "I understand that you may feel better, but it's important to continue the treatment for the full duration prescribed by your doctor." "I'm not taking it," Brett repeated flatly. Dr. Singh, looking frustrated, gave a quick nod. "Very well, I'll inform Dr. Harper." Brett watched him leave, wondering what consequences his decision might have. Moments later, Dr. Harper arrived. "What's this about you refusing to take your medication, Mr. Anderson?" When Brett didn't respond, Dr. Harper walked over to the bed and sat down next to him. Regarding him with a sympathetic expression, she said gently, "I understand how you feel, Brett, but please remember that the liquid is vital to your making a full recovery from the effects of suspended animation. You're not fully healed yet. I feel perfectly fine. I don't want to keep taking it, and I want to know why I'm here," Brett replied firmly. Dr. Harper sighed. "I can see that you're not going to be swayed easily," she said. "So here's what I'll propose. If you take the liquid tonight, I promise to answer some of your questions tomorrow." Brett thought for a moment before replying finally, "I'll take the liquid tonight, but you have to keep your promise." "I will," Dr. Harper said, standing up. "I'll see you tomorrow." "What's on your mind?" Sally asked. Brett looked up from his plate. They were at the cafeteria, and it was obvious that she'd noticed he'd barely touched his food. When Dr. Harper had met him that morning, she'd told him that, after he'd spent the day with Sally, she would return with him to his room to answer his questions. Though Brett wanted his questions answered, he couldn't shake off a growing sense of foreboding. "Dr. Harper has finally agreed to answer my questions," Brett said, looking steadily at Sally. She reached across the table and took his hand. I know you're worried, she said. But whatever happens, I'm here for you. Brett felt a surge of gratitude for her and squeezed her hand in return. Thank you, Sally, he said. I don't know what I'd do without you. She smiled at him warmly. You don't have to worry about that, she said. I'm not going anywhere. That evening, Dr. Harper accompanied Brett back to his room, as she had promised. She began immediately on entering the room. Mr. Anderson, I know you have a lot of questions, and I'm ready to answer them as best as I can. But before we start, I want to make it clear that what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. Are you sure you're ready? Brett nodded, steeling himself. Yes, I'm ready. I need to know. Very well, Dr. Harper said. As you may have guessed, the planet outside of our enclosed cities is completely devoid of any biological life. The world has been uninhabitable for decades now. The planet's temperature began to rise at an alarming rate. The oceans became acidic, the air was filled with pollutants, and then there was the nuclear war. It was a perfect storm of destruction. The planet is irreversibly damaged. Brett sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you mean, devoid of life? He asked. I mean that everything, Mr. Anderson, outside of our enclosed cities is dead. No plants, no animals, nothing. It's all gone. Brett's mind was in a state of shock as the horror of Dr. Harper's words sank in, and he thought about the world that was lost forever. Blue oceans, green forests, clear skies, now just a distant dream. He would never again feel the sun on his face, or breathe the fresh air. He put his head in his hands and wept silently, grieving for a world he had once known and loved. Eventually he looked up. Please bring me the vial of liquid, he said softly. I want to go back to sleep. Dr. Harper nodded, handing Brett the vial she already had with her. Brett took it, his hand shaking as he brought it to his lips. He swallowed it in one gulp, gratefully slipping into unconsciousness. Part 4. Floor 3. The next morning, Brett, in bed, facing the wall, ignored Dr. Harper's attempts to speak to him. He felt a deep sense of despair and hopelessness, wondering what the point of continuing life was in a dead world. Finally, he heard the door close as Dr. Harper left the room, the sound of her footsteps fading away, only to hear her return moments later, stating, Mr. Anderson, I've brought Sally with me. When he still gave no response, Sally walked over to the bed, sitting down on the edge and speaking softly. Brett, look at me, please, she coaxed, gently touching his shoulder. He slowly turned towards her, and Sally saw the torment in his eyes. What's wrong, Brett? She asked, her strange deep blue eyes full of concern. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't think I can face it, Sally. Everything I knew, everything I loved is gone. I know it's hard to accept, but there's still something left, something beautiful and worth living for, she continued in the same soft, soothing voice. I want to show you, Brett. Please, Brett, trust me. Come with me and I'll show you. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, slowly getting up from the bed. Sally smiled at him reassuringly. I want to show you something that I know will give you hope. You won't regret it, I promise. Together they made their way out of Brett's room and down the corridor towards the elevator, Sally leading the way at a brisk pace, Brett following, his heart still heavy with grief, but holding on to a glimmer of hope. Moments later, when they stepped out of the elevator, Brett's eyes widened in amazement as he felt himself stepping back in time. Levittown stretched out in front of him, rows of houses with white picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns and driveways with parked classic cars. The sky was a bright blue with softly drifting clouds. Birds chirped in the trees. Brett's mind was racing with emotions. Sally stood beside him, watching him with a small smile on her face. "Do you like it?" she asked softly. Brett turned to her, his eyes still wide. "It's incredible," he whispered. Then, remembering the window screen in his room, he asked, "But it's not real, is it? None of this is real?" Sally smiled at him and took his hand. "But it is, Brett. It's all real. We can live here together and start a new life." He went over to a tall tree and touched it, feeling the rough bark against his fingers. It was solid and real, just as Sally had said. He looked around at the houses, the cars, and the people walking down the street. "It is real," he said, still in disbelief. "I told you," Sally replied with a smile. "We can get married, live here, have children. We can make a life here, Brett. A life just like the one you had before." He felt her squeeze his hand. "We can have everything we ever wanted here, Brett." As an overwhelming sense of relief washed over him, he turned to Sally and hugged her tightly. When they eventually broke apart, Brett cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply, feeling a rush of emotions flood through him. They spent the day exploring Levittown, walking hand in hand down the tree-lined streets, looking at the houses and talking about what their life together could be. They stopped at a small ice cream shop to enjoy a cone, and Sally told Brett the floor 3 was where the family's city C had been living for generations. She went on to explain that the illusion of the sky was created by a complex system of mirrors and lighting, which reflected the sky from a camera on the roof of the dome. She also showed him how all the plants and animals were real and alive, explaining that they had been carefully selected and bred to survive in the controlled environment of City C. As the day came to a close, Brett and Sally made their way back to his apartment, exhausted but happy, and fell asleep, Sally snuggled in his arms. Wandering through the ruins of his hometown, Brett looked up at the sky's sickly shade of orange, choking on smoke and ash-filled air. He heard the distant sound of explosions and screams echoing through the desolate landscape. Suddenly he was jerked awake by Sally, shaking him by the shoulder. "Brett, are you okay? You were moaning in your sleep." Brett shivered involuntarily, pulling the blankets up to his chin. "I had a pretty bad dream," he stammered, voice shaking. Sally looked concerned. "Is there anything I can do to help? Do you want to talk about it?" she said, gently stroking his hair. He shook his head. "No, I'll be okay. It was just a bad dream," he said, taking hold of her hand and kissing it. Just then there was a knock at the door. Sally got out of bed and went to answer it. As she opened the door, Brett saw it was Dr. Singh. He passed her the now familiar vial. Thanking him, she closed the door. She climbed back into bed, placing the vial in Brett's hand. He sat staring at it in hesitation. "Don't worry, Brett. You won't dream if you take it," she said reassuringly. Brett nodded thoughtfully before drinking. He laid back down on the bed and closed his eyes, feeling the medication take effect. End of part 4.